Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about the sentencing of the former Illinois House Speaker's Chief of Staff and House Clerk and the continued calls for ethics reforms, and the ongoing taxpayer cost of the migrant crisis. I'll then join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss those stories and more. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Do you know what elected officials in Illinois are doing with your tax dollars? Do you want to make sure that your voice is heard? If so, then you need Blue Room Stream, a live and archived video streaming service that provides access to government meetings and events. With Blue Room Stream, you can watch how your elected officials make decisions, hold them accountable for their actions, and be a more informed citizen. Blue Room Stream is the perfect way to get involved in the democratic process and to make a difference in your community. Subscribe today at blueroomstream.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here are some of the top stories from the past week. The former clerk of the Illinois House and longtime chief of staff to former House Speaker Michael Madigan will have to serve 2.5 years in prison for lying to federal prosecutors. Tim Mapes served as Madigan's chief of staff and House clerk for years during Madigan's decades in power. While Madigan will still face trial in the nearly decade-long bribery scheme federal prosecutors called Madigan Enterprise, Mapes was found guilty in August of lying about what he knew. He was sentenced Monday to 2.5 years in prison. Republicans have long pushed for ethics reforms at the Illinois State House. Last week, Illinois House Minority Leader Tony McCombie said that includes how politicians charged with crimes can use campaign money in their defense.
Well, I think the first one is that we shouldn't be able to spend campaign dollars for our legal fees. That certainly would be one.
Madigan, whose trial's been postponed from April to October, spent $8.4 million from his campaign fund on legal fees. Among other reforms Republicans say are needed include giving the Legislative Inspector General more independence to investigate wrongdoing. A deal between the state and Cook County governments will put Illinois taxpayers on the hook for more than $250 million to address the migrant crisis for the coming fiscal year. Taxpayers already spent more than $500 million in the migrant crisis in 2023. Governor J.B. Pritzker announced in November an additional $160 million. Last week, Pritzker said he was in talks with city and county officials about more money. Before the House adjourned last week, Republican State Representative Marty McLaughlin criticized those meetings.
The governor said that all the principals were in the room on this discussion. I couldn't disagree more. The principals in the room should have been 12 million Illinois citizens that expect us to spend their money wisely and efficiently. And more importantly, the businesses and the families that pay the taxes to carry the water in this state, that fund and finance every dollar that comes through here.
Without much other detail Thursday, Pritzker's office announced the state will plan an additional $182 million for state coffers for the next budget year beginning in July. The overall estimate to address the crisis was put at $321 million for the calendar year. The governor delivers his budget address Wednesday. Those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss the news. This is Illinois in Focus, the production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Tired of being in the dark about what happens day to day under the dome in Springfield? Do you want to be more informed in the decision-making process? If so, you need Blue Room Stream, a live and archived video streaming service that provides access to government meetings and events. With Blue Room Stream, you can watch elected officials in action, holding them accountable, and having your say on issues that matter most to you. Blue Room Stream is the perfect way to stay informed about Illinois state government and to be a more engaged citizen. Become a subscriber today at blueroomstream.com.
Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at the Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me again today is Greg Bishop, the Center Square's Illinois Capitol Bureau's senior reporter and editor. How are you, Greg?
Dan, it's another day and another week where we prepare for legislators to come back, and there's going to be a lot of news to be had, that's for sure.
And there was a lot of news this week, Greg, even though they really weren't in session this week. We are recording this first on Thursday, February 15th, Greg, and one of the big news stories of the week, longtime chief of staff of former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison this week for lying to a grand jury about Madigan's inner circle. Madigan himself faces more than 20 counts of corruption-related charges and goes to trial in October. Mapes is just the latest to be held accountable in the federal investigation into what prosecutors call Madigan Enterprise. And once again, after all these other previous corruption-related convictions, Republicans are calling for serious ethics reforms within the State House. Tell us more, Greg.
So yes, this is a long saga that is still playing out because we have former House Speaker Michael Madigan's trial that's been postponed from April to, October, after the November election?
Right before the November election, yes.
So we've got that still at play here, and you've got also just the background of a nearly decade-long bribery scheme that federal prosecutors called Madigan Enterprise, and all of the players that were involved in this. Tim Mapes being found guilty late last year and going into sentencing this week, getting 2.5 years for a sentence for lying to federal prosecutors and a grand jury as to what he knew when he knew it of Mike Madigan's control over this enterprise. Clearly, this is something that's just adding to Republicans and their push for more ethics reforms. And they're wanting things that they say would actually reveal corruption quicker than what federal prosecutors or even state prosecutors could reveal. So things like, for instance, allowing for the legislative inspector general to subpoena individuals in allegations that they may come across, and to do that without the Legislative Ethics Commission having to sound off. So this is something we've covered quite a bit at the Center Square, and that is, of course, the idea of independence of this investigative body and all the inner workings that there are. Previous legislative inspectors general, they have said that the office is either a paper tiger or doesn't have the means to go about and independently investigate wrongdoing. And you had one that was appointed but then quit before their term just recently. So obviously the legislative inspector general is one area that Republicans at least have been pushing for some independence so they can get to the bottom of these types of allegations quicker than federal prosecutors can. And another element that Republicans are looking for, they want to keep elected officials from using their campaign dollars for legal fees associated with criminal cases from when they were in office. Right now, Dan, you know that Mike Madigan has a sizable campaign war chest while he's still facing these charges that he has denied and he's going to trial on. He's spending millions of dollars in legal fees from his campaign account. So some Republicans are pushing for not allowing that to happen. So that's another element that they're pushing for. Another one is to suspend any pension payments to retired legislators if they are facing criminal charges. This wouldn't be a complete removal of those pension payments. It would merely just suspend them until the case is dealt with. But one thing in Illinois law that does kick in is if you're convicted of a crime while you're on, the state resources, you can lose your pension, but this would suspend it while somebody's facing such charges. So these are just a few of the ethics reforms, including a much longer revolving door ban. I think right now it's 6 months. They want 3 years to make sure that lawmakers can't stop being a lawmaker and then jump into being a lobbyist. So those are some of the other ones. But will these actually get traction during spring session, especially if we don't have the Madigan trial headlines that we thought we could have if the trial was to start in April? It's a great question. And something that obviously we'll be tracking all spring long when legislators are on the ground in Springfield.
Well, of course, there is an election in November, Greg. Every single member of the U.S., every seat in the Illinois House of Representatives will be on the ballot. About a third to a half? I think a half of the state senators will be on the ballot. Many of these people who are running for office again voted to elect Madigan to the speakership position year after year after year. So it will be interesting with the election, taking place shortly after the trial, whether or not that will spur anything. And one more point to make, of course, in addition to Mapes, you had the ComEd 4 trial where 4 executives 4 people, either executives of ComEd or lobbyists for ComEd, were convicted of corruption related to this federal investigation into Michael Madigan. So the pieces are falling. Madigan is up next.
Well, and I think one thing that is important to note, too, in this entire thing is the impact of the U.S. Supreme Court, because that's why Madigan's trial has been postponed. Right. There's a question about federal bribery statutes that's being taken up from a totally unrelated case to the Madigan Enterprise case that the U.S. Supreme Court heard and could rule on in the summer. So that's why we have the delay in Madigan's case. So clearly there's a lot more to be said about all of this.
No doubt, Greg, but let's move on. More news this week on the migrant crisis facing Chicago, the suburbs, and the rest of Illinois, and the cost to taxpayers. As a matter of fact, you broke some news just today, Greg, on what Governor Pritzker is going to propose in his next fiscal year budget.
So, the governor's office released a statement today, Thursday, talking about how the governor plans to announce an additional $182 million in the upcoming state budget for caring for migrants. And this would be for housing and a variety of other quote, wraparound services. So clearly, this is a continued cost for taxpayers, but it doesn't necessarily cover all of the estimated $321 million for this calendar year. So state taxpayers have already spent more than $500 million on the crisis in state and local funds just in 2023. And an additional $160 million was announced by the governor's office in state taxpayer funds back in November. Well, today, after meeting with the officials from Chicago and Cook County, the governor's office announced that between Cook County and the states, they're going to be spending more than $250 million in the coming fiscal year. The bulk, the state's going to cover of $182 million in state taxpayer funds. Cook County is going to cover around $70 million. It did not include how much Chicago is going to be covering. But Republicans have been critical about this entire process, a lack of transparency, they say. They also want to see more of where the money's going, who's getting these contracts, who's benefiting from these deals, in addition to how these services and what services are going to be provided. So clearly, this is a growing concern, and I know that there's been reporting on the number of migrants in Chicago shelters decreasing a little, but clearly it's still an ongoing humanitarian issue, but also a growing taxpayer issue. But Dan, this does not include the ongoing cost of healthcare subsidies for non-citizen migrants. And that's something that the state implemented back in, I want to say, 2020, and then they expanded it again in 2021. But when those annual costs were estimated to eclipse $1 billion, the state legislators came back with the governor and they said, hey, we need to implement co-pays. We need some way to try to offset the taxpayer cost of this because it's ballooning. Those costs still there. And that was a $550 million budgeted item for this current fiscal year. The projections are it's going to cost upwards to $700+ million. So what it's going to look like in the new budget that the governor proposes on Wednesday is going to be very telling. We'll be watching that space closely. But all of this, of course, is just a small snapshot in the total cost of state taxpayer dollars for the state budget. And we're going to get a whole lot more information from the governor when he addresses the budget situation come Wednesday.
And I will say, too, listeners of Illinois in Focus, we will be live webcasting the governor's budget address next Wednesday, a little bit before noon at thecentersquare.com. Greg, one other thing regarding the migrant crisis. There's a new report out from S&P that is warning municipal credit rating downgrades for these municipalities, such as Chicago, also Denver and New York City, because of these ongoing taxpayer costs and the taxpayer burden that the migrant crisis is causing in these communities.
Yeah, so I'll just read a quote from the story Brett Rowland put together, and it's a quote from S&P Global Ratings. A new report, they said, state and local governments are shouldering the rapidly growing cost of assisting migrants and asylum seekers as their numbers increase in the U.S. If the issue remains significant enough for long enough, the increase in cost and social service requirements could affect states and local governments' credit quality. This comes, of course, after Illinois still low on the total number of states when it comes to credit for these credit rating agencies, and we did see some credit upgrades. During COVID, with the flood of federal tax dollars, despite what that may have done to inflation, that flood of federal tax dollars coming to state and local governments to the tune of $8+ billion just to state government, let alone the billions of dollars that went to local governments and schools and universities. And then you look at the money that went into the private sector as well, and how the state was able to benefit from that increased economic activity and the sales taxes and so on. And they were even getting some income tax revenue, Dan, from people on unemployment, interestingly enough, which was also enhanced during COVID. So now you've got the credit upgrades that were given during that time, and state policymakers heralding those credit upgrades. When you see a report like this from S&P talking about the long-term costs and the impacts to credit quality for a state like Illinois and other states that are welcoming states, self-proclaimed sanctuary states and cities, it's interesting to see these credit rating agencies give that type of warning. But Dan, honestly, we've seen these warnings for Illinois in practically every credit rating, despite that rating going up or down or staying stable. The warnings about long-term debt, the pension debt, the ongoing unfunded liability, the post-employment benefits for state pensions. Illinois has among the worst funded pension systems in the country, and that's been an ongoing concern. So now, on top of that, as a credit impact, you've got this migrant issue as well in the taxpayer cost. Now that's stacking on top of other continued concerns that credit rating agencies have.
And the reason why taxpayers should care about a local government's or state government's credit rating is it drives up the cost of borrowing. You pay higher interest rates with lower credit ratings. Taxpayers pay higher interest rates when credit ratings suffer because of things like this. Greg, couple of things out of the Illinois legislature in terms of bills that have been filed. One, we've seen it in some similar other blue states across the country. It would essentially accuse parents of child abuse if they refused or denied their children getting things like puberty blockers or transgender type care things. Tell us about this bill.
So State Representative Ann Stava-Murray filed House Bill 4876, and what it does is it would amend the Abused and Neglected Child Reporting Act, and it would say that an abused child is someone whose parents deny abortion services or gender-affirming services. And parents' rights groups read this bill, and they are alarmed. They say that it takes away parents' rights to essentially make decisions for their minor children, and it would essentially say that parents considered a child abuser and possibly lose their children and the custody of their children if they don't affirm transgender drugs, surgical procedures, or abortion, for example. So Ann Stava-Murray, her legislation, it's stuck in Rules Committee, and there's been a lot of pushback online. I did reach out for comments, but I didn't get anything back. However, she was on Facebook responding to commenters, essentially saying that, quote, trans kids go through irreversible damage from a puberty that doesn't match their gender identity every day in this country. Parents' rights groups like Awake Illinois, they say that this goes too far and it's radical. And if a minor opts for, say, hormone therapy and the parent says no, that means that parent could be considered an abuser of a child if Stava-Murray's measure passes. So clearly, it could just be a policy proposal. We'll see if she wants to advance this, but right now it's stuck in Rules Committee. And people who watch the legislature know that the Rules Committee sometimes is where legislation goes to die.
Let me just add here, Greg, these kind of procedures, they're life altering. You jump in head first and you go through with this, there's no going back. So I don't know if there's any age limits defining, a juvenile or a child in this thing, but generally we consider a child 17 and under. So you're telling me if a 12-year-old goes to their parents and say, they want to essentially become transgender, if a parent blocks a 12-year-old or tries to talk a 12-year-old out of it, again, it could be 10, it could be 14. I don't know. I'm not sure what the ages are. That just seems that I don't know. I can understand why there's significant pushback online. Let me leave it at that. Well, let's move on, Greg, because there's another piece of proposed legislation I want to talk about, and that would essentially legalize what we call assisted suicide in Illinois.
Yeah, so the Illinois Coalition for End-of-Life Options is looking to advance legislation that would allow for an individual who's terminally ill, say given 6 months to live, the option of talking with a doctor and getting medicine that would assist in the end of their life. They call it end-of-life options. A lot of people may hear this and think it goes to, say, planning for, a burial plot or something along those lines, or, hospice care, for instance. But ultimately, it would allow for somebody to end their life under certain circumstances. Now, this wouldn't open it up to where anybody could do this. You would have to, get a doctor's opinion and then maybe get a second opinion. Then there may be a mental evaluation as well involved. But obviously, this is an issue that advocates are pushing for at the Illinois State House. And we do have indication that they're really at a moment right now of trying to inform people to get them to understand the option here that they're hoping to promote and to get passed. Will it be top billing at the Illinois State House? We'll watch as it progresses through spring session, but it could be just one of many different pieces of legislation that could get a lot of controversy surrounding it.
Lawmakers return to the state capitol next week. Governor Pritzker gives his budget address and State of the State address on Wednesday, and that's really when things start moving, right? So this legislation, this proposed legislation we talked about in this episode, we'll probably be writing about that at thecentersquare.com. Listeners can keep up with that. Greg, we have just a short amount of time to talk about one last story, and that's a new report that came out this week that the Center Square reported on. Illinois' corporate income tax rate is now the second highest in the country.
So the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation ranks state by state on corporate income taxes, and last year's report, Dan, we were ranked number 3. This year, we're ranked number 2. That is something that is driving others to criticize state policy, saying that we have high corporate income taxes and that impacts the availability of jobs in the state. When you're looking at the 9.5 rate, that's number 2 in the country, with number 1 being Minnesota at 9.8%. But WirePoint's founder, or rather WirePoint's president, Ted Dabrowski, he says that he doesn't see any change because policymakers in the Democratic supermajority seem to want to continue their spending, and therefore they're going to have tax revenue for their spending. So he doesn't see any changes coming in the future when it comes to the state's corporate income tax rates and any efforts to try to lower those rates in order to be more competitive and more attractive for job creators.
And of course, all of Illinois, you mentioned the only one ranked higher than Illinois, or who has a higher income tax rate, is Minnesota, but all of Illinois' neighbors, Iowa included, are lower. Iowa is a full 4 percentage points lower than Illinois at 5.5%. There's concerns, of course, and there's been ongoing concerns for years that these kinds of policies, these kinds of tax and spend policies, drive jobs elsewhere. Greg, as always, thank you for your insights to these very important stories to Illinois taxpayers, but we are out of time. Listeners can keep up with all of these stories and more at thecentersquare.com. Please subscribe. Thank you for listening.